In Lab 13, we are going to start by looking at divisions of the nervous system. We are going to look at some nervous histology later, and we'll also talk about the spinal cord in a separate video. But to start, there are kind of two main divisions of the nervous system. The first one being our central nervous system, and then we also have our peripheral nervous system. So we're going to start with a little flowchart here. Our central nervous system, I'm going to abbreviate with CNS. Peripheral nervous system will be PNS. So our CNS is going to be just the brain and the spinal cord, just those two things. But we have a lot of other nerves in the body coming off the spinal cord, and those are going to be peripheral nervous system. So that is everything else. We'll see nerves, we'll see a term called ganglia, or ganglion singular. And all that means is it's a group of neuron cell bodies. So we'll have some of those when we talk about the spinal cord. Overall, we have 12 pairs of cranial nerves and 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So we are going to look at cranial nerves in just a few labs. So those are something you really want to know for the lab exam. However, we are not going to talk about spinal nerves. So we can cross those out for now. They will come up when we talk about the spinal cord and kind of which pathways merge to form a spinal nerve, but beyond that, you do not need to recognize them on a model. So we have many, many divisions of the nervous system. So our two main divisions are CNS and PNS, central versus peripheral, but these can be further divided. So all together, let's go ahead and make this clear. Together, these are going to form our nervous system. And CNS is pretty straightforward. It's just brain and spinal cord. PNS is where it gets really complicated. So we're going to have some further subdivisions of our peripheral nervous system. So I'm going to go ahead and draw my chart here. And they are going to further divide themselves. So it can get pretty complicated. We are going to look at some examples to help differentiate between these subdivisions. So first off, peripheral nervous system will divide into our autonomic nervous system. I'm just going to use NS for nervous system. Sometimes you'll see it referred to as ANS. And then the other option is our somatic nervous system, or SNS. So when you see the term autonomic, I want you to think automatic. So let's write that in blue. These are going to be things that we don't have conscious control over. Somatic, think bodily. So soma means body. We've seen this when we talked about the cell body of the neuron. We called that the soma. In this case, somatic refers to the fact that we have bodily control over this division of the nervous system. So things we would expect to find here would be sensory organs and voluntary muscles. Voluntary muscles being our skeletal muscle that we can voluntarily contract. Let's compare that to our autonomic nervous system. This is more things like our internal organs and glands, which we do not have conscious control over. Maybe they're contracting through smooth muscle. We've got cardiac muscle that is involuntarily contracted. And of course, we have lots and lots of glands that are regulating the internal environment of our body. And we don't have conscious control over those. So those are the main differences between these types. And then we can further divide them. So let's look at autonomic. We'll continue on this pathway. Autonomic can further be divided into parasympathetic and sympathetic. And these refer to whether we are activating something like an alarm system or if we are trying to return to rest mode in the case of sympathetic. Okay, one thing to be careful about is I wouldn't recommend abbreviating parasympathetic to PNS, because then you can confuse it with our peripheral nervous system abbreviation. So when you talk about these subdivisions, I would use the full term, parasympathetic nervous system versus sympathetic, so that you don't mix it up with PNS for peripheral nervous system. Okay? So parasympathetic is going to be our rest and digest system. And we don't have conscious control over this, so we're talking about things like heart rate, sweat glands, all of the internal tissue that we can't consciously control. That is going to be involved in this rest and digest versus fight or flight response. And we're going to talk about some examples in just a minute. Let's finish off our flow chart first. So we have, on the other hand, our somatic nervous system, which is more voluntary. We, in this case, are going to have a motor nervous system and then a sensory nervous system. So when you hear the term motor, I want you to think motor control. We're doing something with muscles, because muscles are responsible for all of the motor output, the movement that we create. So motor nervous system is going to be our voluntary skeletal muscle. And then sensory organs are going to be responsible for sending info back from these receptors to the brain, to the central nervous system. And we're going to look at lots and lots of examples of motor versus sensory pathways, because that's super relevant to the spinal cord. Down here we have this really confusing diagram. So what we're seeing here is the layout of the somatic versus the autonomic nervous system. On the left-hand side, we have these neurons. So this chart, if we break it down, it is actually very useful. We're talking about central nervous system, and then everything that has to happen from that point of contact with the central nervous system to get a signal to an effector organ, or vice versa. When we have a sensory receptor receiving information from the environment, this is the pathway it has to take to get back to our spine and our brain. So that's all this chart is about. You don't have to understand everything here. You don't have to understand the neurotransmitters involved, but I want to point out some characteristics of the somatic versus the autonomic system. So the really cool thing about our somatic system is it's really target specific. So let's go ahead and write that down here. Target specific. And what that means is we're going to have, in every case of the divisions of the nervous system, we're going to start with neurons in the brain that are going to communicate with the effector organs. In this case, with the somatic nervous system, we have a neuron and then a really long axon that is traveling all the way to our effector organs. In this case, we have skeletal muscle as an example. And what that means is this is target specific. So when we want to contract a muscle, we just contract that singular muscle. We don't have to contract all of the muscles in the area. So we have a really long, we're going to call this preganglionic neuron. And this will make sense when we look at the spinal cord. Basically, we're saying this neuron and this axon are one unit, and it's a really long axon going all the way to the local area of the effector organ. And that's what makes somatic system target specific. Now, if we compare that to autonomic, it looks a little different. And there are 3 different examples here. We're not going to go over all of them, but they all share the same general characteristics. So our autonomic nervous system is less target specific. It's more wide scale changes in the body. And what I mean by that is we still start in the central nervous system. So we start with a neuron sending out a signal to the body, But you can see here this neuron and its axon are much shorter. So they're not traveling as far of a distance into the body towards the receptor organ. One example we'll see is the control and regulation of hormones in the body. So we're going to still have specific areas of the brain that are regulating the production and control of our hormones. But in this case, they are less target specific. So things like hormones are going to be released into our bloodstream, and then they're going to travel to specific target organs. They don't travel all the way there using this neuron and this really long axon like we have in the somatic nervous system. So hopefully that makes sense. All of that goes to say our somatic system is really specific to the target organ, whereas our autonomic nervous system is going to have more widespread effects in the body. So I want to talk a little bit more about examples and some of the terminology we will see with these systems. So let's start again with that somatic system. So one thing to know about the somatic system is, in addition to these terms, motor and sensory nervous system, we have two new vocabulary words, and these are afferent and efferent with an E. So when you see the term efferent, I want you to think exit. Efferent information is going to exit from the central nervous system. It's basically information that's taken from the CNS all the way to the effector organ, in this case, muscle. That is efferent information. So sometimes we call the motor nervous system, the motor division of our somatic nervous system, the efferent division. Compare that to afferent now. This is for sensory information that is taken from a receptor towards the brain. So it's the reverse. Efferent, we have information exiting the brain. Sensory, we have afferent going towards the brain. You can write that up here as well. So this is a really important term to know, because we will see these terms pop up over and over again. Let's draw our arrows here. So efferent is going to exit. Remember that term exit, because efferent information is going towards our target organs. Afferent, we're accessing the brain with an A. We're going towards the brain. So this is taking sensory information from our receptors throughout the body towards the central nervous system for processing. Okay? Study those, make sure you know those terms, because they're going to pop up when we talk about the spinal cord. Okay, lastly, I want to talk about gray versus white matter. So this is a topic that will pop up over and over again when we are looking at the CNS between the brain and the spinal cord. So in the brain, I have to be very clear here, when we're talking about the brain, our gray matter is going to be the external part, and the white matter is going to be more internal. So in this image here, the darker shaded external pattern we see is going to be our gray matter. These are our gyri and sulci of the brain. The internal part, all of this deeper stuff that does appear lighter, that is going to be our white matter. And beyond color, these two have different materials. So white matter is mainly going to be axons. And this is true for the spinal cord and the brain. When you see white matter, think axons. And the reason it appears white is because we have myelin sheaths surrounding our axons. So we've talked a little bit about these before. You'll see it again with histology. Myelin sheaths are going to coat axons to allow more rapid communication or more rapid propagation of an electrical signal. So that is why white matter appears that way. It's made of those axons. Gray matter is mostly neuron cell bodies. or soma. So these are going to be areas of regulation. We're regulating muscular and sensory activity, whereas white matter is more central to that transfer of information, what's allowing it to communicate rapidly between neuron cell bodies. This is inverted in the spinal cord. So in the spinal cord, our gray matter is more internal, and our white matter is going to be everything else that we see. White matter includes the body of the spinal cord, but it also includes things like our roots, our ventral and our dorsal roots, and our spinal nerves. So those are all mainly axons that are relaying information between the gray matter in the spine and in the brain. Now there's a couple other terms for talking about the brain versus the spinal cord. So in the brain, we call these groups of axons, these groups of white matter, tracts. TRACT for tract. When we're talking about everything outside of the brain, we refer to these as nerves. So when we talk about the spinal cord, we have spinal nerves, not tracts. It's the same material, but we need to be careful about which term we're using, nerve versus tract, when we're talking about the spinal cord or the peripheral nervous system versus the brain. We will talk in the next video a little more about the spinal cord, so we'll talk about ascending tracts and descending tracts. But if we go ahead and break those terms down, ascending tracts of white matter are going to be taking information to the brain. They're ascending towards the brain. But we know this is white matter because we have that term tract popping up. Ascending tracts are afferent with an A. And this makes sense because they're ascending towards the brain. They're taking information to the brain from receptors. Descending tracts do the opposite. They're exiting the brain. There's that term exit with an E popping up again. So they're going to take information from the brain. In this case, we're sending motor information from the brain to our receptor organs, which are often skeletal muscles. We will see these terms pop up again with the spinal cord. So there's one other term I want to talk about. And by the way, all of these terms, afferent, efferent, they apply to neurons because we're talking about the tracts of neurons. So we're going to see some things when we talk about reflex arcs called afferent neurons, efferent neurons, which are going to be taking that efferent information away from the brain. And then we have a third term here, interneuron. So an interneuron you can think of as a connecting piece. Sometimes we'll see them called association neurons. These are found only in the CNS. And we will see them more specifically in that cross-section of the spinal cord. And these are really important for reflex arcs, which we'll talk about at the end of the next video. But basically what they're doing is they're just helping to integrate information between the brain and those receptor organs. So we'll talk about two types of reflex arcs that either have interneurons or don't have them and how that affects their function.